Well, I'd like to use this developing drawing by Charlie Lineweaver, a designer based in Melbourne, to illustrate the value of polylines in landscape design. And a polyline is a really powerful entity in the landscape design environment. If I click here, you may be able to see that the pond is defined by this sort of curving shape. And if we come over here to the properties box, you can see that it's a polyline, and it shows very clearly, and I've copied it here to the left, and those, we zoom in a little, the vertices of that polyline are in fact numbered, and there are a lot of properties in this box associated with it. Perhaps one worth mentioning initially is that any closed polyline, and this is, you can apply curve fitting. You have a number of different curve fitting types, and it won't make an awful lot of difference to the shape here because the polylines are relatively close together. So the shape of the polyline is defined by those vertices that you see, and we see them because grips are turned on. If you want to edit any polyline, it is essential that you have grips showing. So one thing to check is to go to Tools and Global Parameters and to Grips, and just make sure that you haven't inadvertently turned off grip. If I say, no, don't show them, and we click on it, we don't get the grips, so we can't edit that polyline easily. So let's go back and fix that. Global parameters, grips are now on. You can, of course, change the other properties of those grips. So every polyline has grips, and we can edit them. We can manipulate them in quite a number of ways. Well, let's start our examination of the editing of a polyline by generating a simple one. So we'll draw a polyline. I'll just click around and I'll right click and enter. There's the polyline, but notice this gap. And the properties box tells us here that it's not a closed polyline. And you might well close polylines, especially when you're making shapes like this one. But you can close them really at any time. Once grips are enabled, and they are, and we've drawn the polyline, the vertices, the clicks, I initially clicked here and worked my way anti-clockwise. Any vertex can be moved. So you're editing very, very simply just by letting your mouse hover over the grip and moving it to a new position. Let's do a major one. You can see how the polyline just adapts as we move things around. We can delete a polyline. Let's get rid of this one. So I let the mouse hover over it, and actually we'll demonstrate doing a fillet first. We can set some sort of fillet radius, and it'll form a fillet or a curve around here. So look, okay, that, and it has done a fillet, a tiny one. And again, we can manipulate things and move things around. So grips can be manipulated in a variety of ways. Let's experiment a little further, and we'll go into properties and we'll say we'll make it closed. And once we've got it closed, let's get that fillet made much wiser. Clearly our 20-unit fillet was not a sensible value. We can set the color of the polyline. Let's make it red. We can say we want it filled, and I'll escape from there. There we have, and it's still able to be manipulated very easily without issuing a command, but just clicking on the vertices. So you have a single entity still, and yet it can be a very complex shape. It doesn't have to be a shape with a large number of vertices. I think, what have we got? Trying to find the end here. Well, we've certainly got close to 100 individual vertices in that complex shape. And I'll show later a simple technique for generating that shape based on existing geometry. But I digress. One other thing you could do is just change the intensity of the colour. This one here has colour 162, but we've set transparency at 130, and that gives you subtle changes to colour. So let's make this one 100 and enter. We're not actually interested in the transparency here. We're not trying to see landscape design entities under the water, of course, although I guess you could if you had an ornamental pond and you were planting water plants, you might possibly want to see the location, but I digress. So can you see we're changing the properties of that polyline very, very efficiently. We could, let's bring it back to our colour. I think it was 162. And that one had 130. Let's bring it back to no transparency, 255. Now it's a nice solid colour, but you can get a greater effect by applying, not a greater effect, but a more interesting effect by saying we'll put a point there and we'll have our start colour left just white for the moment, and we'll make our end colour the 162. And there you can see we've got quite a serious point gradient now. I'm not quite sure here. No, there hasn't been a point gradient added. But what we can do is change the gradient length. You know, we would like it more washed out. So let's change that to, say, 90%, the value there. And we've got a more interesting effect. Notice that the start colour of the spot is centrally placed. You can change an offset. We could change that from, say, 50 to 65, and you'll notice the white spot moves. So there's an awful lot of configuration that you can do on the filled polylines and the application of a gradient. If you change from a point to a linear gradient, you'll get that sort of an effect. You can even go for your horizontal direction. You can go vertical top to bottom. So there's hours of fun playing with that sort of capability in CAD+. Let's come here and give it a gradient, point gradient, and the end colour will stick with the same 162. And we'll make the gradient length maybe 95. And now we've got a very subtle effect on that shape, much more interesting than the one here. Although if I said we'll apply some curve fitting and do that, again we get a more organic shape. So I'm doing a lot of editing of the polyline. We can move vertices, we can add vertices, we can edit vertices, we can fill it around a vertex, we can change colours, we can change transparency, we can apply fills. So it's a hugely versatile tool. I did mention earlier that I would tell you a little about a hack that can save a great deal of time. Let's eliminate this. We have a colour of 162 and a transparency of 130. So we delete it. Now we are working with, let me first click here. That's a polyline, a closed polyline over the outer area of decking. But let's imagine we want to put that pull in. What you can do is say, I'll draw a hatch. I'll make the hatch a solid hatch. Bear with me a moment and we'll say we're going to pick a point. What GCAD Plus does is radiate out and finds and forms a new boundary. And we'll say, yep, well, that's fine, and we'll OK it. And now if I remove the fill, I'm left with a lovely polyline, a closed polyline, which I can fill with my colour 162 with a transparency of 130 and what did I miss? Colour 162 transparency filled. So that's a good illustration of how much editing you can do just with that properties box. So I hope you can see that you can save lots of editing time if you just use polylines wherever possible.